Hi everyone. About a year ago, Professor David Miano on his YouTube channel made a highly critical video of my work on the zodiacal theory for interpreting ancient artworks, and especially he focused on Pillar 43 at Gobekli Tepe. His channel, by the way, is called World of Antiquity. This is a screenshot from the beginning of his video. Now, his channel is aimed at debunking what he considers misconceptions about ancient history. And as my work says some somewhat radical things about ancient prehistory, I suppose my work would eventually fall under his gaze. Now, David contacted me in advance about this, about making his video, and we exchanged correspondence about the details of my work. I asked David many times instead to write a rebuttal of my research to an academic journal, seeing as my work is published in academic journals. But paraphrasing him, he said this is essentially beneath him and a waste of his time. So he made a video instead. Now, the reason I much prefer the usual academic route is that the debate would be refereed by a journal editor, and so any personal digs and criticisms would be prevented. He would have been forced to stick to arguments based on the evidence. Also, it would limit the number of responses, so a never-ending and tiresome back and forth argument would be prevented. David would have his one shot at presenting his key arguments against my proposals. I would have my response, and that would be that. Anyway, David published this video instead, in which he targets both my work and me personally, which is unacceptable. Now, David is an adjunct professor of history in the US at a well-respected university, so he should know better than this. My understanding is that his research specializes in the ancient historical period of the Eastern Mediterranean, but not the prehistoric period as far as I understand. But I should add, and I think this is relevant, I don't think David has much, or any, proper training in science or mathematics. And I think this is relevant because my research into prehistory is based on the scientific method, and it uses some basic mathematics. So he's probably not best placed to review it. That's not a personal dig at David at all. I think these are simply the facts. Now, his video criticizes specifically my YouTube videos, which serve as an introduction to my book Prehistory Decoded, shown here. I never intended these videos to be standalone. They were always intended to serve as a gateway to my book. But my impression from his comments is that David hasn't actually read my book, which is regrettable because I expect it would have helped him to make a better video. Many of his comments are addressed in my book. If he did actually read my book, then that makes his video even worse. Now, I'm not going to try to rebut every sentence in David's video. That would take far too long. His video is nearly an hour and a half long, and it would take me 5 times that to address every point at least. So instead, I'm just going to focus on those parts where he attacks me personally, and on the part where he tries to use my statistical method for evaluating Pillar 43 at Gobekli Tepe, which is the most important part of this whole debate. So let's jump forward to his first criticism.
I'm Martin Sweatman. I'm a scientist at the University of Edinburgh, and in this series of videos I'm going to show you how we discovered a very ancient zodiac.
You may be curious what kind of scientist Martin Sweatman is. He's a chemical engineer with a PhD in physics. That expertise doesn't really come into play in this hypothesis, but he does put his general knowledge of scientific principles to use, not so much in the formulation of his hypothesis, but in the defense of it.
Well, I would strongly disagree with David's assertion there. My expertise is in statistical mechanics, which means my professional research concerns the analysis of the configurations of atoms and molecules. And this is exactly the kind of expertise that is useful in decoding the symbols at Gobekli Tepe. The logic and maths that are used to analyze configurations of atoms and molecules can be applied straightforwardly to patterns on stone pillars. There's really not much difference. Of course, David wouldn't know about that because he's got really no idea what my professional research is all about. If you're interested to know about this decoding methodology, I explain the logic and the ideas from scratch for this kind of pattern matching study on my blog at martinsweatman.blogspot.com. It's a kind of tutorial. I give a link to the article below this video. So I would contend that my expertise is far more useful than David's, and for the same reason more useful than Gobekli Tepe's archaeologists. Actually, I think David's comments there reveal a deep-seated bias against science and what it can offer. He's even warned me directly on Twitter to stick to my own research field, which is a kind of genetic fallacy. In other words, he thinks only people like him, so historians and archaeologists, can know the truth about our past. But that kind of thinking is philosophically bankrupt and eventually leads to the creation of religions with people like David as their priests. I think this shows he doesn't really understand the scientific method at all. And this is amply demonstrated in his video. For example, he makes frequent errors in his video that relate to his misunderstanding of the difference between developing a hypothesis and testing a hypothesis. He confuses these time and time again. It gets very tiresome. For example, he criticizes the parts where I'm simply developing a hypothesis by effectively saying, "But you don't know that," or by asking for strong evidence to justify an assumption, which is anti-science. I think it's worth reminding David about the scientific process. Here's someone who should know.
Now I'm going to discuss how we would look for a new law. In general, we look for a new law by the following process. First, we guess it. Then we don't laugh, that's really true. Then we compute the consequences of the guess to see what, if this is right, if this law that we guessed is right, we see what it would imply, and then we compare those computation results to nature, or we say compare to experiment or experience, compare it directly with observation to see if it works.
So there you go. Science begins with a guess. No justification for the guess is needed, because that would then result in a never-ending cycle of justifications. Then, once you have guessed a hypothesis, you test it by comparing predictions with observations. And that's it. Well, whatever David thinks about it, I think it remains the case that my hypothesis is the only one for which a statistical test has been created. It's not perfect yet, but I clearly point out the areas that are subjective and which might become more scientific in the future with more work on the pattern matching algorithm. That's something I'm currently working on. Let's carry on.
It turns out that Dr. Sweatman is a big fan of alternative history and lost high technology.
Now that's a slanderous fabrication. I have never uttered fanatical or even mild support for the idea of lost high technology. This is completely unacceptable, and David should remove his video or remove that remark from his video.
And this interest preceded his work on this subject, so it would seem his efforts were intended from the beginning to establish the truth of lost advanced civilization.
Again, this is completely untrue. Another slanderous fabrication. I have never uttered support for any lost ancient high civilization. If you had read my book, David, you would know this. Again, you need to remove your video or this slanderous remark from your video. Of course, it suits David's purpose to misrepresent me personally like this, which is why I would rather he had written a journal paper, because these kinds of personal attacks would not be allowed in a journal paper. So no, I have never uttered support for a lost ancient high civilization or for lost ancient high technology. What I do think, based on the available evidence, is that ancient people were keen, naked-eye astronomers. Nothing to do with ancient high technology or ancient high civilization, just good, naked-eye astronomy. But this should be expected. There is every reason to expect ancient people would be good astronomers, given that all resources at that time, tens of thousands of years ago, depended utterly on the seasons. People lived at that time completely in tune with the seasons. They had to survive. And the seasons can be tracked accurately with simple naked eye astronomy through the solstices and equinoxes. I'm far from the first person, academic or otherwise, to suggest this, and there is plenty of evidence to back this up. And if David had read my book, he'd know this was my view. Now, the surprising thing my work does suggest is that ancient people, like those at Gobekli Tepe, were using some constellations that are similar to our modern ones. Not exactly the same, but sufficiently similar that we can see the correlations. Of course, David misrepresents my position on this too. This is one of his favourite strategies. It's called the straw man fallacy. So what he does, over and over again in his video, is misrepresent my ideas, and then he proceeds to criticise those ideas. He makes sure the misrepresentation is close enough to fool the unwary, but nevertheless, his criticism applies to the things he has made up and not my ideas. It's classic straw man tactics. See what he says here, for example.
For our purposes, we're focusing specifically on whether the zodiac, that is, the zodiac whose origins we were able to trace firmly only to about 500 BCE in Babylonia, existed here, thousands of years earlier. Actually, not specifically the zodiac, but the entire Greek set of 48 constellations, which we established last time to have been subsequent to the Babylonian system.
That's completely untrue. I have never made that claim, nor do I have any evidence for it. I claim only that some of our familiar zodiacal and a few nearby constellations were known approximately, nothing more. What I mean by approximately is that they were sufficiently similar to be recognizable in terms of the symbols used. So that's just one example of his favorite strategy, the straw man fallacy. Let's look at another example of this kind of fallacy, which in my view is the only one that really matters in David's entire video. This is the part where he attempts to use my statistical method to evaluate Pillar 43. Just so that you know what's going on, to provide some context, in this part of my statistical analysis of Pillar 43, I compare each animal symbol that appears at Gobekli Tepe with the constellation that we hypothesize is represented by an animal symbol on Pillar 43. So take Pisces, for example. We hypothesize that this bending bird at the top left of Pillar 43 represents the constellation Pisces, which would be the autumn equinox constellation at the time of the Younger Dryas impact, roughly 10,800 BCE. So here they are shown side by side. Now this is my hypothesis. In this case, it's that the bending bird represents Pisces. To test this hypothesis, we compare all the other animal symbols at Gobekli Tepe with the same constellation, Pisces in this case, and put them in ranked order. And we do that for each of the animal symbols on Pillar 43. So here is the table of the 7 constellations we expect are written on Pillar 43, in addition to Scorpius the Scorpion, with the animal symbols ranked against them. And as you can see, according to my view, in nearly every case, the animal symbol already in that position on Pillar 43 is better, or as good as, any other animal symbol at Gobekli Tepe for representing that hypothesized constellation. So, for example, I rank the bending bird first amongst all the animal symbols at Gobekli Tepe for representing Pisces, and so on. So according to my view, represented by these rankings, it's extremely unlikely that the best animal symbol would appear in every position on Pillar 43 rather than some other animal symbol that could have been chosen if they were placed purely by chance. And what this means is that Pillar 43 can be read as a kind of date stamp, since the constellations we hypothesize are represented on it can be read as a date using precession of the equinoxes. So that's the essence of this hypothesis test. Note that I'm comparing the constellations as they appear in Stellarium, which is a popular astronomical software, with the animal symbols at Gobekli Tepe. And by constellations I mean the patterns of points and lines in Stellarium, shown here. Now, of course, you might disagree somewhat with my rankings, but nevertheless, by going through this same exercise, you can obtain your own statistic for how good the hypothesis is. You can come to your own conclusion. And as I said earlier, it might eventually be possible to create a more objective and scientific route to establishing these rankings. So what does David do with this hypothesis test? After all, this is the absolute key to my theory. Well, as I said, he performs another straw man fallacy. You see, what he does, or at least what he says he does, is ignore the lines in Stellarium, and then he somehow compares the distribution of constellation points, so that's the positions on the stars only, with the animal patterns. Let's see him do this.
Okay, I've put in my ranks. Very subjective, of course, as anyone's would be. Many of Dr. Sweatman's choices, I don't agree, match the constellations to the best animal, as you can see. And to be clear, I use the configuration of stars, not the lines. Okay, the drawn lines there are modern.
But that process is nonsense. It's meaningless to compare points without lines between them with a two-dimensional animal symbol. You see, points are dimensionless, so they can't map out any two-dimensional pattern at all, unless you connect them up somehow, for example, with straight lines. That's just basic mathematical logic. Of course, David doesn't realize this, probably because he's almost no training in mathematics. In effect, though, although he doesn't say this explicitly, he is implicitly making up his own lines and patterns in his imagination. Now, as I said, David and I had communicated via direct message on Twitter about this, so he knows very well my argument, but instead he decided to effectively make up his own constellations. He never actually reveals the lines he was imagining between the points. He just asks you to trust that he has made up some good ones, and then he compares them against the animal symbols. Now it's obvious to anyone that this is not my hypothesis anymore. He's implicitly made up his own lines, so he's testing his own hypothesis, not mine. That's the straw man argument right there. In fact, it's worse than that, because by making up his own patterns, which he never actually reveals, he creates an invalid hypothesis. You see, in order for a hypothesis like this to be valid, it's not allowed to depend on anything which might be influenced by the person making the hypothesis. So, in my case, I'm comparing the animal symbols at Gobekli Tepe with the constellations, that's the lines and points in Stellarium, and I've had no influence on either of them. They both existed before my hypothesis was developed. But in David's case, he implicitly made up his own lines, which means they could easily be biased. And that invalidates his hypothesis. If I had made up my own lines to fit the animal symbols on pillar 43, that would be equally invalid. And David would have pointed that out as a flaw straight away, with good reason. Yet David seems to think he can make up his own patterns. That he can't do this should be obvious to everyone, including David, but he seems not to have realized this. In fact, David asked me specifically about this point. He asked me what this line in our paper meant. So this, what I'm showing here, is our rebuttal of the archaeologist's response to our initial Fox paper in 2017. So here we say, note that we are comparing given constellations with given animal symbols. This is not an arbitrary process and is therefore statistically meaningful. What this means is that our hypothesis is valid because we have no influence on either the animal patterns on pillar 43 or the constellation patterns in Stellarium. On the other hand, just underneath, we say, it is common in popular media and across the internet to take a different approach, where given or arbitrary symbols are compared with arbitrary star patterns. This strategy is statistically meaningless and therefore not scientific. This means you're not allowed to make up your own star patterns. Now, even though I explained these sentences to David at length, he seems to have ignored them. Now, David's argument for making up his own lines, as you just heard, is that the lines in Stellarium are modern, and therefore they aren't valid either. Let's hear him say this again.
To be clear, I use the configuration of stars, not the lines. Okay, the drawn lines there are modern.
So according to David, it doesn't matter that he effectively made up his own lines, because the ones in Stellarium are modern inventions too, and he doesn't see any difference. Of course, this argument is nonsense. It assumes that David's implicit or effective lines, which as far as we know are completely random, are as good as the lines that appear in Stellarium, which is, of course, ridiculous. And here's why. For starters, we can assume the makers of Stellarium are trying their best to reproduce the Greek constellations, by which I mean the points and lines. And secondly, the Greeks wrote down their constellations with the intention that they could be reconstructed in the future. The best source we have is from Ptolemy's Almagest, about 150 AD, where he describes the position of each star in a constellation in relation to its symbol. So here's the page in Ptolemy's Almagest relating to Pisces. As you can see, these descriptions are very detailed and should allow construction of the constellation lines by themselves. Just in case there is some doubt, we also have the Farnese Atlas, which actually tells us what the symbols look like. And again, this is from about 150 AD, and it's thought the Farnese Atlas and Ptolemy's Almagest are both based on the constellations of Hipparchus from about 150 BC. So from these sources we can recreate the Greek constellations, that's the points and lines, as the Greeks might have imagined them, at least approximately. Can we recreate them perfectly? No. But we can expect that the points and lines in Stellarium are a reasonable reconstruction of how the Greeks saw the sky, because the Greeks told us what their constellations looked like, and the makers of Stellarium are deliberately trying to reconstruct them, using points and lines as best they can. At the same time, we can have no confidence in David's imagined lines, because they're biased, as he made them up himself, and he doesn't reveal them anyway. So his hypothesis is fundamentally flawed, and this should be obvious. In fact, it's so obvious that it calls into question David's competence in this area. He seems to have a very limited understanding of the scientific method, and as I said at the beginning, David has limited experience with scientific hypothesis testing and mathematics, and I think it shows. I think he's out of his depth here. Indeed, I think it's fair to ask why David did this. It's so obviously flawed, there must have been a strong motivation for him to do this, rather than use the lines in Stellarium or similar software. My guess is that David realized that if he did use the lines in Stellarium as they are, rather than making up his own, he would get a strong statistic that he felt he would have trouble arguing against. And there's a clue in his video which supports this view. Let's listen to what he thinks of having to use the lines in Stellarium.
If you or I wanted to do this for our own matches and have him judge ours, we would get to place ones in all the boxes, and it would come out to a probability of 1 in 140 million. Now let's say that you thought none of the animal symbols fit. What would you put in the box? Not an option. He's forcing you to choose a number.
Yes, I'm forcing you to use my hypothesis, David. That's the whole point. And by the way, it's not about matching, it's about ranking. What David is saying, though, is that he doesn't like to be forced to use the lines in Stellarium. But if you don't do that, David, it's no longer my hypothesis. He's basically admitting defeat here. What this shows, I think, is that David is having trouble reconciling what he thinks he knows about prehistory with what his own eyes are actually showing him, and he simply can't face that level of cognitive dissonance. In any case, his entire YouTube channel is dedicated to debunking what he sees as misconceptions about the past, not agreeing with them. So he's got a huge amount of skin in the game. There's no way he was ever going to agree with me. The problem for David is that sooner or later he's going to tackle an issue that is actually correct and isn't a misconception at all, and he's going to look a bit foolish. Anyway, I think it's obvious that rather than confronting my hypothesis properly, he ducked it entirely by making up his own lines and his own hypothesis. Classic strawman fallacy. And it doesn't get any better. David uses several other kinds of fallacy, apart from the many strawman fallacies, in his video. For example, David sometimes states things as fact, when in fact they are not known with any certainty. This is strange behavior for a historian who should know better. Let's take a look at an example.
We learned in our last video that the ram symbol for Aries was certainly not the original one in Babylon. I suppose we could assume that the ram tradition can be traced back to another source, but the problem is We already know that the classical set of constellations combined two separate traditions, and that could have happened no earlier than the Hellenistic period. Yet Dr. Sweatman wants to assume the combined system existed thousands of years before it possibly could have. It's all very ahistorical and anachronistic. He needs to address this objection, and as far as I know, he never has. And I don't mean just saying, oh, well, the mainstream view is wrong. I mean, show us how your system doesn't contradict any of the existing evidence.
So, David thinks it's known beyond any doubt that the Greek set of constellations were created in Greece in the latter part of the first millennium BC, shortly before Hipparchus. In fact, this is not known with any certainty. It's just a convenient story that historians like David like to promulgate based on a logical fallacy. What we do know is that the first written evidence we have for our zodiacal constellations dates back to the Mulapin and the 3 stars each lists, which at the earliest date to the mid-2nd millennium BC in Babylon. And we also know that the first written evidence we have for any of our non-zodiacal constellations is in the early classical Greek texts, such as Homer's Odyssey, which were probably first written down significantly before 700 BC. And that's it. We don't know when any of these constellations were actually invented, and we certainly don't know when the full set of Greek constellations we know today was assembled. It's entirely possible that the full set of constellations was already assembled, say, by 3000 BC, and that, for whatever reason, the Babylonians decided in the mid-2nd millennium BC to write down some of the zodiacal constellations, and that a few hundred years later, the early Greek authors decided to use some non-zodiacal ones in their stories. And that view is entirely consistent with the historical evidence we have. And you don't need to take my word for it. That's basically the conclusion of this paper by Professor Bradley Schaefer, which is probably the best paper published on this subject, published in the Journal for the History of Astronomy, where he suggests that based on all the available evidence, the full set of Greek constellations was likely known already by 1100 BC and possibly earlier. Schaefer's conclusion, by the way, is based on the evidence contained in those written texts, on what they actually say, and is not just based on when those texts were written. David, on the other hand, is, I think, basing his view only on when a few surviving texts were written. His view doesn't take into account the possibility that not everything that happened in history was written down, and that not everything that was written down has survived. His view is a kind of perfect, idealistic view of the surviving written historical record, and it also ignores other forms of evidence. And it's basically total nonsense. Indeed, there's a convenient phrase for this kind of logical fallacy, which is that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. In any case, this entire point is another strawman fallacy. Remember, I have never suggested that the entire set of Greek constellations existed at Gobekli Tepe, so any discussion about exactly when the Greek constellations was assembled is irrelevant. David is making a strawman fallacy on top of a logical fallacy. In fact, when you remove all the personal attacks on me and the numerous strawman fallacies, and all the logical fallacies, and all the genetic fallacies, and all the demonstrably incorrect statements, and all of his archaeoastronomical errors, and all of his misunderstandings about the Younger Dryas Comet impact, and all his misunderstandings of the scientific method, and all his misunderstandings of mathematics, and his idealistic view of the historical record, you'll find there's almost nothing left of his video. No wonder he wanted to make a YouTube video rather than write a proper journal paper. Funny thing is, if you explore his YouTube channel, you'll see that he's made quite a lot of videos about how to avoid making fallacious arguments. So that's all these ones with the orange banners. Yet his own videos are crammed full of them.